So welcome to Good News Format. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. And we're delighted to have Alexander Fink, Dr. Alexander Fink, and he is the director of the Institute for Faith and Science in Marburg in Germany. He studied physics at the universities of Beirut and St Andrews in the UK, and received his PhD at the Institute for Biophysics at the University of Regensburg. I probably butchered all of those names there, but we're really delighted to have you on the podcast today. Now, it's true that after having worked as an industrial product manager, you became director of SMD Graduates Ministry. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that's work with students, is it?
That's work with finished, completed students, the graduates who have graduated and now work either in PhDs or in jobs, in secular jobs somewhere in industry or in schools and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And your passion is the dialogue of science, faith, and worldviews. It's true that you've given lectures around Europe, but is it true you actually you've made 2 documentary movies? Is that right?
Yes, 2 documentary movies. One is Our Fascinating Universe. It's about cosmological arguments like the Big Bang and the fine-tuning of the universe. And the other one is More Than My Brain, which is about neuroscientific issues, free will, consciousness, and so on, and how these can be interpreted in different ways than just materialism and naturalism, which is usually the default interpretation worldview of these issues when you look into popular science.
And are they available online?
They are available at the website of visionvideo.com. It's an American book company, but they also sell documentary movies and so on. Yeah, I can send you the link.
Yeah, we can put the link. And you also have a podcast yourself, don't you?
Yes, it's a German podcast. It's the Begründet-glauben-Podcast, which is connected to one of our websites. We have 2 websites. One is our institute's website, and the other one is the Begründet-glauben.org website, which deals with questions of science, culture, worldview, and faith. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad you pronounced that.
Yeah. I agree. It's also hard to translate. I think the best translation would be something like justified believing or justified faith, like having reasons, having justifications for your faith.
Very good. Very good. Lovely. And you're married yourself, and you have a couple of kids?
Yeah, we are actually, I'm a physicist, and so we have a system. I'm Alexander with an A, then my wife is Bettina with a B, and then I have 2 children, Caroline and David, a C and D. And I know that the alphabet has more letters, but that was the point where it stopped with us, even though we were open to have more children, but it's great fun.
That's very good. Very good. And you coach a soccer team, I read, as well?
Yeah, it's 10 and 11-year-old boys. My son is also one of my trainees, so to say,
Yeah.
and it's also great fun. But actually, I didn't plan that. But the problem was there was no one who wanted to coach the team, and so everyone is busy here.
Yeah.
And so I thought, but that's so important, and there are 15 to 20 children who want to play soccer, and so I thought someone needs to do it, and so I started to do that 3 years ago. And so now I accompanied them year by year, and now we are in the E-youth in German, so to say, which is the 11-year-olds, and we will proceed in the next years. Yeah.
Very good. Well, how did you get, because you're a physicist, how did you get interested in science, and particularly physics?
Well, actually, I think it started already at school. I was always interested in where do we come from, where did we originate, and where does it go to? And so I always watched documentary movies on TV, and I paid attention in my physics classes. A lot of people find them boring, and of course they can be boring dependent on the teacher, but fortunately I had a lot of teachers who really were able to raise an interest rather than destroy it. And so, yeah, that was about the time where I thought I want to know that. And so in my hometown north of Bavaria, we also had an observatory for stars, which sometimes organized lectures on scientific, but also on faith issues. It was always interdisciplinary. And so I sometimes went there and listened to these debates and these talks, and it was very inspiring for me. And on the way, usually I had a great view of the night sky when I walked there, because there was not so much light and so on. So I could really see the stars and would always think, wow, what does that show us? Where do we come from? And so on.
So it were those big questions of the universe that actually drew you in the science then?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I look into the stars, I just into the sky, I just see that there is a vast amount of space, and either there is nothing and it's just matter, and that makes me just a little piece of dust with no significance, with no meaning. I have to create my own meaning, or there is someone who is even bigger than this universe and has created that with a purpose. And so that was one of these big questions that really bothered me during my childhood, during my going to school and so on. And so at the end of my school days, actually, I also met people who believed in the God of the Bible, and I joined their group. And yeah, I started to actually pray and say, God, if you really exist, then show yourself to me in a way that I can understand you. And there were a lot of interesting ways how that worked out somehow that I could not have made up myself.
Okay. Okay. It's a very hard thing to shake, is that intuition that whenever we look at the stars that there's someone out there. It seems to be a very deep thing in humans particularly, that we know by intuition that there's someone or something out there.
Yeah, and that's the point, because if we measure the skies, then we just have numbers and quantities. But the fascinating thing, it's not only about measuring these things, but we perceive that they are beautiful. And so it seems like there is a message behind the stars, and we just don't know the message. And as well, the whole question of order, I mean, maybe we'll come to that later, that there is more to the universe than just material processes. It seems that there is an arrangement that made possible that we can exist. And so this is really fascinating. The more you deal with these issues, the more it makes you think that there are deeper layers to reality.
So you've grown up and you've worked in academic areas and arenas, and there seems to be a perceived conflict between science and God. Do you think that is a real conflict?
I think on the surface, as some people say that Heisenberg, the Nobel Prize winner, said that the first nip of the cup of science makes you an atheist, but at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting for you. And I think if you look on the surface, then you realize that you don't need Zeus or Jupiter in order to explain thunder and lightning and so on. We have now science, and science can explain these things by ions and electrons, and these explain the natural mechanisms, and there is no God involved, as it seems. But of course, this is only on the surface, I would say. If you look at how things hang together, how the universe is structured, how life is structured, that there is information at the bottom of life, for example. I think there are pointers that really make us think, is it possible that chance and necessity can actually produce such an intricate system that is somehow aimed at the existence of life, of conscious life, of intelligent conscious life, of human beings that are even able to discover these laws in nature, which helped to make us exist in the end and help to sustain us in our life. And so that's a really interesting thing. And still there are people who would just stay on the surface and say, well, I don't see any God out there in the universe, and so I don't believe there is one. But actually, if we found God sitting on an asteroid orbiting around Earth, for example, or around the sun, I mean, that would not be the God we think of in the great monotheistic religions, because we don't believe that God is immanent, that God is actually a part of creation, but we believe that God is transcendent. It's very similar to a painting of Van Gogh, for example. You can do very intelligent measurements as a physicist and as a chemist, analyzing a nice picture of Van Gogh, for example. But none of these measurements will help you to prove that Van Gogh actually existed and that it was him who created that picture. You don't find Van Gogh in his pictures. And it's similar with God. You don't find God in the universe. But of course, God, like Van Gogh, can have left fingerprints in his creation, hints that point to his genius, to the way how he designed the universe, to the way how Van Gogh actually painted the pictures that he painted. And so I think that's a very nice parallel that shows what we can expect when analyzing nature, what we can expect to get to know about God, and what we cannot expect. We cannot expect to measure God himself, but we can expect to find fingerprints that would point to the existence of a personal God, I think.
C.S. Lewis used to give the illustration of the architect designing the building, and you'll not find him in the building, but you will see his personality and his personality through the building, but you shouldn't expect to see him in the wall anyway. And that's the same with God. So
Yeah.
the conflict between science and God is on the perception level at the surface.
I would say it's a worldview level. Yeah, it depends where you come from. It's like when you are trained with a certain worldview, you will either realize you can perceive these fingerprints of God, or you perceive that you don't. On the other hand, it's highly interesting that even atheists like Richard Dawkins or like Francis Crick made interesting statements. Like Dawkins defines biology as the study of complicated or complex things that give the appearance of having been designed, which indicates that he realizes there is something more to life than just mechanisms. It looks like it was planned, designed, but he says it's just an illusion. And the question is, who bears the burden of proof if the design appearance is obvious to everyone, even to atheists? And Francis Crick says the same, like we always need to keep in mind and bear in our mind when we do biology that what we look at was not designed, but rather evolved by natural processes only. But the point is, how does he know that it was not designed? And why should natural processes themselves already disprove an author of these processes? I mean, if you understand a car, that does not prove that there is no author, no creator of the car, no designer of the car, no engineer who built it, and so on. So there are some false dichotomies, some false controversies somehow at this debate.
So the debate isn't necessarily about the science itself, it's more about how it's the worldview behind it, what we perceive science is pointing towards.
Yeah.
So you've got two scientists, one, let's take Richard Dawkins, and the other one, Francis Collins. One convinced atheist and one convinced Christian. But both of them looking at the same science, and one of them perceives God and one of them perceives nothing. So it's not the level of conflict isn't science per se, but it's the perception of that and the explanation almost of the science. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, definitely. And there are these picture puzzles, like the lady that you can view either as a young lady or as an old lady, for example, depending on how you interpret the picture. And there have been psychological experiments that show that if you are trained first with a picture that resembles more the old lady, then you will see the old lady again in the picture puzzle, and the other way around as well if you are trained with the young lady first. And I think it's similar if you don't believe in God and you don't want to believe in God, then you can interpret nature in a purely naturalist way. While I still would say there are deep open questions, like the question why science works at all, for example. And as a Christian, for example, I can see fingerprints of God in science, but I even have a good explanation why science works at all, the scientific method. So there are differences. And I mean, if you are an atheist, then you always have the problem that finally, in the end, the universe tries to understand the universe. My brain tries to understand the universe. My brain tries to understand the brain. And then the big question is, if the brain is just a product of irrational processes, if my thoughts are identical with the firing of the neurons in my brain, then this is just a product of irrational, naturally governed mechanisms. And for what reason should I trust these thoughts then? How can I be sure that even there is a brain under my skull? Because it's just a thought of exactly this brain that was composed by chance and necessity. And there was no purpose behind that, like this brain has to be designed in a way that it can find out truth. No, it was just an optimization process that I can procrete in the best way, so to say. But the question is whether such a process should actually result in a brain that is able to understand truth and understand reality and even the deeper layers of reality, like the law of gravitation and all the fundamental laws of physics and so on, that can describe nature in an amazing way. But actually, my daily life works perfectly fine without understanding these laws. And a lot of people don't even understand these laws because they hated physics at school and so on. And they can still live in this world. So it seems it's not a direct advantage to survive or to produce offspring and so on. Yeah, but as a Christian, on the other hand, I would say I know why it works, because I am created in God's image. So I'm somehow a partaker in God's rationality. I reflect God's rationality. Of course, I'm limited. I'm much smaller. I'm just a created being. I'm not the creator, but I can think God's thoughts after him to some degree. And that's really encouraging to know that. And then if God has created the universe as a rational God, then I can expect that there are rational laws that are embedded in the universe. And that's actually the way how science started in the beginning. That people like Copernicus or Galileo Galilei or Johannes Kepler, they did not sit down and say, let's do some experiments about nature. And then after some time, they were surprised. Oh, there is a law. I'm surprised there is a law. No, it was the other way around. They thought God is a lawgiver. He gave laws to the human beings. So he also must have put laws into nature. And so they expected laws. For example, Johannes Kepler was so persuaded that there must be simple, rational, beautiful laws behind the orbits of the planets around the sun. And so he analyzed the data for 6 years, more than 6 years, until he finally found out the famous Kepler's laws that we still learn at school. And he found out it's more easy to use ellipses than circles and so on. And so he really was persuaded there must be laws and we must be able to find them. And in the end, he did. So that was the starting point, actually, of science. And it's like a congruent triangle. You have God who created the universe, you have God who created man in God's image, and so God put his laws in nature and he gave his rationality in our minds, and so with our minds we are able to understand nature. And that's a great explanation for me why we can understand nature and why nature is ordered and can even be described by the laws of mathematics, which is also not self-explanatory why matter, as it is a dumb material thing with no mind or something, why they behave according to natural mathematical rational laws.
That's so different to what we commonly hear, because that what you're saying there, to kind of sum up, is that we need to be able to trust our minds, and we can't trust our minds without a God. If unguided naturalistic evolution is true, then that produced our minds, and how can we trust our minds then? And then what you're saying is we need regularity in nature, and those early scientists went after that regularity because they believed that there was a lawgiver who put these laws into the universe. And so what you're kind of saying there is that even our scientific method and understanding and ability to even explore this universe came out of a worldview, a biblical worldview, not an atheistic one. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and it's actually a curious fact, because when you look into Chinese history, they had some advantages in technology. Like they had the gunpowder already, which the Europeans brought back to Europe only in 13th century and so on. So they were further advanced, or even the Arabs, in medical knowledge and so on. But they never really explored nature as a rational system, like how can we do that? And in China, this can be explained by the worldview. Sinologists have actually covered this topic, and they came to the conclusion that the problem about China is they don't believe that there is a rational structure underlying the universe. They think it's all like emanations of forces, like of yin and yang and so on. And we can grasp some of the principles, but it does not necessarily mean that there are regularities that we can even predict and so on. So nature cannot be boxed into a rational system. As we found out, it actually can, to some degree, of course. Boxed in does not mean we can control it completely, but I mean, weather forecast works quite well, I would say. And even many other things, like we can do very complicated medical operations and change things in our body, and suddenly things work again that seemed to kill us before that. So a lot of this is possible, and there are laws in nature that can be understood, and even be understood by means of mathematics and so on. And that was the starting point that was given by the lawfulness of the biblical worldview, that there is a lawgiver God. And of course, there were some Greek influences as well, like Pythagoras, who believed that numbers are actually at the basis of everything. But I would say that numbers are also important in the Bible. If you read, like the days are counted through and so on. So numbers somehow play an important role there too. And so this is the way how science developed, somehow assigning numbers and natural events to each other and realizing there is a correlation.
One man said that other civilizations had technology, but the scientific method itself, that kind of idea of go and explore the universe, if you can trust your mind that the universe is regular, that was born out of the Judeo-Christian mindset. And I think that was helpful, that other civilizations had technology, but it wasn't until the mind, the regularities, that monotheistic God, that kind of took hold, and the regathering of that in the 16th, 17th century, that's when the scientific method really took off.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to know that Professor Whitehead, who also is the origin of this thesis, was not a Christian. He was rather an agnostic, tending probably more towards atheism. I'm not completely sure about his position, but he was not a Christian, at least. And so he came up with that and said that, why did science start? Because we believe that nature is not God. It's free to explore nature. We don't need to be afraid of nature taking revenge if we cut trees and so on the one hand, and then that there is a lawgiver God who gave laws to nature as well. Yeah.
But that is against the trend of what we all the time hear, that Christianity is anti-science, it's holding us back. But if what we're saying is true, then it's Christianity and the Judeo-Christian mindset that set science free.
I think there is a misunderstanding behind that often. I mean, if you read the Bible in Genesis 2, God already commands science by asking Adam, please name the animals that he would show. And if you name animals, you need to have categories of what the differences and the commonalities are and so on. So this is actually the start of something like taxonomy or biology. So science starts at the very beginning, or at the first day, at the first chapter of Genesis, when the stars stars are created, they are given to determine times and periods and feasts and so on, which means use the regularities of the sky as a clock to structure your year and so on. So it's a command to do science. But then, of course, we have this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And some people think that this actually is the prohibition of science. But it's not the prohibition of science. It's just we should not get to know evil from inside, because knowledge in Hebrew is different from knowledge in the Greek language. The Greek language is just propositional knowledge. Like, I know that X is red, or that Y is large, or something like that, assigning properties to substances and objects and so on. But in Hebrew, actually, knowledge is yada, which is the same word that is used when Adam met his wife, and he actually had sex with her. And that's the same word yada. To get to know her in a deep way, in a personal way. And so what God wanted to prevent is that human beings should not know evil from the inside. They should not be familiar or intimate with evil, but should be on the good side, on his side. And so I think if you know more about the biblical background, then you can easily understand that it's a complete misunderstanding to think that the Bible prohibits science. Far from it. It encourages science, but on a moral ground, the Bible and God's word want to help us not to get to know evil as evildoers, but keep away from doing evil.
Yeah, no, that's genuinely helpful. But it might be worth chatting a little about, I suppose, what is called science, and probably what I would say pseudoscience is it's different to proper science. So, like, just in reading this last 6 months or so, and last year, you do come across statements from scientists that are not actually scientific statements, but they're more statements of preference, or statements that are based on prediction, and that are taken as scientific fact. And it happens on both sides of the aisle. But I think it would be helpful to even define what science is as different to prediction, as different to preference, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I mean, science is defined in many different ways. And if we take a very strict definition of science, then it's just the summary of regularities that have been observed and categorized. So it is definitely tied to measurements. And if we take this very strict definition, then of course we can only talk about science in the present, because only here we can reproduce observations in experiments or in nature and so on. And the past, for example, what has happened in the past is always a singularity, because it happened once and then time was gone and moved on and so on. And also the future, science is always open to the future. We can never be completely sure, because if we are if we remain strict in the scientific method, then yes, we always make predictions, but we are always open to these predictions to be falsified. That's why often we make different predictions in order to test which hypothesis is more plausible. But when extrapolating back, for example, if we are honest, then the measurements that we can do is only light from other stars, for example. And to interpret this light, we need a lot of assumptions, of course, like the wavelengths of this light. They often appear to be shifted to the red spectrum, which indicates that energy has been lost. And now the favorite interpretation of that is, of course, that this is the case because the stars move away from us. This does not necessarily have the only interpretation, but it seems to fit to quite a lot of things that we can observe, like the cosmic microwave background and so on. But where does this light lead us in the end? It leads us back to only about, if we construct a model with Einstein's general relativity theory, it only leads us back to about 300,000 years after the origin of the universe, after the so-called Big Bang event. And we can't look beyond that experimentally, empirically, because that's the light that is left over, because before that time, according to the models, the cosmos was not transparent, meaning that all the light that was emitted by atoms and by energy sources and so on was absorbed again, because there were lots of ions and free electrons, and they could absorb light, and they absorbed all the light. So only after the atoms actually became neutral, like protons and electrons formed together a neutral atom, only after that light was free to propagate, and to do so until today. And so that's a limit to empirical science. And then if we do theoretical science, we can calculate models of the universe back to the beginning of time, but we will never reach time zero, because the equations break down at the latest point at the Planck time, which is about 10 to the minus 43 seconds or something. So a very short time, but it's not zero time, it's after zero time. So we cannot even go back to the event itself from which our universe originated. That means there is a lot of freedom, of course, to interpret these data, and you can construct theories where there are other universes from which our universe was created, maybe. But it's also quite plausible that there is an absolute beginning for space, time, and matter, and that was right shortly before this Planck time, so to say, and that is what we call the Big Bang.
So like, how much of that can you take as like, because it's based on like solid mathematics, based on solid observation, but how much of that can you, like, science proper is what I'm getting at, like, how much of that can you take?
Well, science itself only can measure the light of distant stars. That's all we have. And we have different kinds of stars. That's also, we can distinguish, for example, supernovae are very important to determine the age of the universe and so on. But all we can do in astrophysics is measuring light, and then fit the data to the equations of Einstein somehow. And of course, that's a complicated process, and you need to presuppose things in order to do that. For example, the geometrical structure of the universe, that it's homogeneous and so on. Only then you can really apply Einstein's equations in a very straightforward way. Otherwise, you would have to have constraints to these equations, which can complicate matters quite a lot. But of course, there are some reasons to assume that generally the universe is rather homogeneous on large scales. Of course, not within the galaxy, where you have a lot of planets and solar systems and so on. But on the large scale, between the galaxies, you have a lot of empty space. But still, that assumption might be wrong. And so the data could, if there is a very bright genius in the future and has a different idea and takes some good different constraints and can fit the evidence to a different explanation, that might be the theory of the future. So that's one of the basic points of science, that it's always preliminary. It will never end science. Science is always open to be tested, and the test can always fail. That can always mean that, for example, and we had that 100 years ago, scientists believed that the universe is static and eternal and does not really change on the large scales, only on tiny scales, like on planet Earth, for example. But on the large scale, the universe would not change. And Einstein believed that himself, for example, which was one of the reasons why he fiddled around with his equation so that it would allow such a solution, a stable, eternal solution. Later, he said this was his largest mistake and the most stupid thing he ever did in his life. But it turned out that this was a very important thing. But that only turned out in 1998, interestingly. So it shows that scientific models can rule over a certain time, and we have good reasons for them. But they can be wrong, because it's empirical, it's testing things, and we also always come from a mindset, we always come from presuppositions, and only when evidence accumulates, or when people are creative enough to use different paradigms and mindsets, this is the time when old paradigms come to break down and new paradigms are actually established. And that happens again and again in science. We can never say that we have arrived at ultimate truth right now. We cannot say that because the scientific method does not yield ultimate truth. It only leads evidence, which makes certain models of nature more or less plausible.
That's interesting that, like you said, our science cannot yield ultimate truth, but this it's continually tested and continually evolves in that sense. So, in a sense, there's a lot that we can know through science, and we're thankful for its what it has produced. But it would be fair to say that there are limits to what scientific knowledge can help us understand.
Yes, there are definitely limits of scientific knowledge. For example, if you take the question of ethics, yeah, I mean, I can measure the probability that a nuclear power plant will explode and that there will be a large accident. I can measure and I can predict what will happen if that happens. I mean, we had an example in Chernobyl in 1986, for example. But science cannot tell you whether you should build nuclear power plants or not. And as you see, different governments have different attitudes. France, for example, says we need to build more nuclear power plants in order to reduce carbon dioxide levels and so on, to reach the 2-degree level in climate protection and so on. And the Germans say, oh no, we should not use nuclear power plants because they are not sustainable. And you have all this nuclear waste that produces large problems for generations to come, hundreds and thousands of years and so on. So there are different opinions and different ethical conclusions based on the same scientific models. So science cannot tell us what to do. I mean, think about the black widow spider. It's very successful in nature, and it actually is famous for eating its husband after they they produced offspring, so to say. And so it's very successful. So should we behave in the same way because science has found out that this is very successful? No, of course not. And of course, we are no spiders. That's one argument. But actually, science only observes what is, but it does not tell us what should be. It does not tell us whether it is good how the world is. It just tells us how the world is, but not what is good. And always when you draw from the state as it is, when you make a conclusion to how it should be, only on natural arguments, this is the so-called naturalistic fallacy. You cannot arrive at an ought from an is, as it is usually called. And so ethics is a clear limit, for example, for science. And I mean, so science has also inherent limits. We have talked about that. It can also only deal with reproducible events. It cannot really deal scientifically with singular events in the past. Like we cannot put Emperor Caesar in the lab and determine whether he actually crossed the Rubicon or whether he didn't, and so on. That's a historical thing that we need to find out with historical means. And we can also only come up with plausibility arguments that history makes sense if he really did cross the Rubicon, for example. But when you take the resurrection of Jesus, for example, then of course, the message of that is that God interfered in history, in nature, and did things that normally, regularly don't happen. So science helps us to realize there is a special event that is unique in history, the resurrection of Jesus. But scientifically, we cannot put it in the lab because the Bible itself says this has only happened once, when Jesus died and was raised again, and it will happen in the future when God will intervene again. But this is something that science simply cannot analyze because science only deals with natural processes only. And so this is another limit of what science actually can do. So there are methodological limits to science, reproducibility, preliminary falsificationism. And then, of course, there are social limits like worldview presuppositions. No one starts from an empty sheet of paper, but everyone gets trained by people, and so we get certain questions, certain models in our mind, and maybe by doing this, of course, we get to the front line of science, of scientific research, but at the same time, we might overlook that maybe some issues could be explained in a different way, and that there might be paradigms or models that have been completely overlooked. So it's always important to ask, what do we actually presuppose, and what could help? What alternatives would there be, for example? And especially when you come to the very large questions where there are a lot of presuppositions, and where these presuppositions have a large deal to play, then it's especially important to look at them. Like, what is the origin of life? What is the origin of the universe? And so on. I think here worldview presuppositions play a very important role. And of course, we have limits within physics, like Heisenberg's uncertainty teaches us we will never be able to know everything about nature. For example, with elementary particles in quantum mechanical systems, we can only know with a certain amount of certainty, for example, the location of an elementary particle, but then we don't know the velocity, the momentum of that particle with the same accuracy, and so on. So there are different limits, physical limits, methodological limits. There are social or worldview limits to science, and we need to acknowledge them. And actually, if scientists are honest, they should always say, these are the data, and this is what I extrapolate from the data, how I interpret them.
Absolutely. That's great. That's really helpful. Kind of a sum of that. So Christianity is not anti-science in any way. That's important to really say. But what would you say to someone who's been put off the notion of God by science?
Someone who says that he was put off by science, put off from God, and not believing God because of science, or what? Sorry, I did not really understand.
Well, I met a guy a while ago, and we got chatting about spiritual things. I said I was a convinced Christian, and he said he was convinced atheist. And I was like, oh right, well, how did that happen, or what pushed you to that? And he said, well, I'm an atheist because of science and reason. So I kind of very quickly said to him, well, I'm a Christian because of reason, as well. But to someone like that, to someone who's maybe listening to this, who is interested but being put off, probably because of how the media portrays the conflict, what would you say to that kind of a person?
Well, I would first of all ask, why do you think that science has refuted God, or why you don't need God? Because, as I say, on the superficial level, it seems like natural processes account for a lot of what we see. But the question why science works, why we can understand nature, why there are natural laws in science, these point already to a deeper level of reality. And then there are even levels in science that actually point to a deeper level of reality. For example, we have no idea what matter itself is. Usually we think matter is everything that is somehow solid and that we can really measure and so on. But when you look to the elementary particles and to the very small compartments of matter, you realize there's a lot of empty space and a lot of fuzzy energy somehow. So matter is by far not well understood what it is. It seems even in quantum mechanics that the deeper level is not matter, but information. For example, Anton Zeilinger, a quantum physicist from Vienna, wrote a paper a bit before it, 20 years ago. And in this paper, he claims that if we assume that information is actually the basic quantity or the basic stuff of which the universe is made, and matter has just arisen out of information, that would make sense of a lot of what we observe in quantum mechanics. For example, quantification, because information is quantized. Yeah, bits are 0 or 1, they are quantized. We don't understand why energy is actually quantized, because energy could take every possible continuous level generally, just thinking about it. But it's not the case. There are basic packages of energy, for example, and that might have to do that energy and matter is dependent on carrying information, for example. So that's another physical reason. And then we have the question of life. It was an amazing discovery when we found out that the reason why we have these complex molecules in living cells, and only in living cells, not anywhere else in the non-living nature, that these molecules are actually there because they are encoded, they are coded by the DNA, by another chemical substance, by another chemical molecule, the famous DNA, and this is called the hereditary information. It shows actually that information is actually primary to living organisms. And if we look at that, if you travel to another planet with a spaceship and you discover there is a system that is based on information and produces very complex machines that fulfill certain functions that are necessary for that information system to work, then I think it's very plausible to conclude we need to be careful on this planet because there might be an intelligence around. And if now aliens would come to our planet and find our life and how life works, I think they could easily come to the conclusion that there is someone who constructed all of this life, who has done something about that. But of course, this is so intricate, and it's very questionable whether there is life without information processing. That it seems that the basis of all living beings is someone who is intelligent, who has a mind and deals with rational thinking and can even produce an algorithmic code that helps to produce living beings all the time. And then we come to the level of consciousness, of course. The big question about consciousness is you can measure neuroscientific correlates in the brain, like which neurons are firing and which electrical states do they have, and so on. You can measure this, but you cannot see actually or measure the thoughts of people, or see the pictures, the images that they actually see, or hear the sounds that they hear. This is really a fascinating thing if you think what the brain is actually doing. We see light waves, and they are perceived via the sensors in the eye. And these photonic signals, electromagnetic signals in the end, are actually transferred into electrical currents in the brain and into electrochemical potentials in the neurons. If you hear sounds, this is a sound wave, which is something very different from light waves. They are also converted in the brain into electrical signals again. So everything that we feel, that we hear and so on is actually what we can measure is only electrical signals. But what we experience can be so different, like pain, feels like, ouch, I'm hurting. It's an electrical signal in the brain. When I see a nice picture of Van Gogh, for example, it's an electrical signal in the brain. But it seems that reality is much richer than just the electrical signals. So there is much more, like if you are a naturalist or a materialist, you really have to explain all this away as material processes only. And that's, I think, quite a hard thing to think about consciousness, about information in life, about the fine-tuning of the universe for our existence. And so I think this is not proof for the existence of God, but I don't think that science necessarily needs to put you away from God, but rather should make you think about there must be a greater intelligence. And I mean, there are people who have gone that way, that route. For example, Antony Flew. I mean, he was a very famous atheist philosopher in the 80s and 90s. And especially after the fine-tuning of the universe became more and more corroborated in 1998, for example, he really turned his mind and he said, like, actually, we need to follow the evidence. And the best explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, and why nature actually obeys rational laws, and why there are purposefully designed organismic beings, and so on. I mean, these were the three main arguments that he gives in his book. He says we need to follow the evidence, and the best explanation is that there is an infinite God, an infinite mind, who is himself not dependent on matter and so on, but rather is the creator of matter and put all the information and the purpose into nature, into creation. He would not go that route because of revelation, but only because of scientific arguments. So it shows even science itself and the results of science can be strong pointers towards a personal creator.
That's very interesting. I've never heard that argument of information from the physics of things. I've heard it from DNA, but from the physics of things. Yeah, maybe it'd be good if you could give me a link to that paper as well. I'll put that in the description.
I think in physics it's not that popular because it's still hard to really get measurable results from that. But
yeah.
It seems that our concept of matter actually hits on very difficult limits when we look to the details, to the elementary particles and so on. And it seems that information becomes more and more important. For example, entangled states can be explained by an informational field or something that keeps information together. But it's really one of the big mysteries of science right now, how entangled states can actually work in quantum mechanics. But that's a different issue. It might be too complicated for that session.
Very good, very good.
Schrödinger's cat is a nice example of that as well.
Yeah. Anyways, watch the Big Bang Theory understands that and sure. Yeah. So rather than science taking us away from God, you would be convinced that science itself shows God's fingerprints upon this universe. It just does this as we do finish. Do you want to just take us through some of the, I know you have already, but even to mention them again, some of the levels of evidence that you would see that science would then push us toward belief in a mind and a God behind this universe?
Yeah, I mean, to sum that up, I would say, first of all, the scientific method is neutral to worldview presuppositions, which I think is very important. And that fits again very well with the Christian God, because he gives us freedom. He does not force us to believe in him. He invites us, but he does not force us, but he gives fingerprints. He gives indications of his existence. And so what are these indications? I think, first of all, that the scientific method works, and it works really well. And we have good reasons for that, as I explained earlier. Then that there is something rather than nothing. It's really hard to understand why, giving the energy conservation laws and so on, why this universe exists and exists for a long time and is stable. So there must be a reason, there must be a cause for this universe to exist. And the universe is not self-explanatory because it has a beginning. So there must be a deeper reason behind that. And again, the Christian God is a good candidate for that. It's not the only candidate, but it's a good candidate. And then the universe is also fine-tuned to the existence of us to a very high degree. If you change the fundamental constants of the forces and of the masses and so on of the elementary particles, you often have no atoms as we need them, or you even have no stars, no planets and so on. You have no universe with a structure and so on. So all these parameters must be in a certain area so that we can exist, and they do. So this is another pointer that there is someone who wanted us to be here and who is intelligent enough to actually accomplish that, to create a world that we can exist. And then we have life. Information is actually the on the bottom of life. Without information, there would be no life. We had no DNA, we had no reproduction of genetic information and so on. All the building plans of these complex molecules that are necessary for life to exist. Even bacterial simple life, as we call it. Simple, actually, bacteria can be quite complicated already and complex. And then we have, of course, all these fascinating organs that seem to indicate purpose. Yeah, a bird's wing is obviously optimized to fly. And the same is true for many other things, like our fingers, our arms, our eyes, our ears, and so on. You see the purpose when you look at these organs. Sexual reproduction as well. It's not easy to produce and to invent even organisms that sexually reproduce. There are a lot of things have to be fine-tuned so that that works. If two different organisms come together and produce offspring. And then we have conscious life, which is also, as I indicated, something that is hard to reduce to material processes only. It's more. And then, of course, we have the whole realm of ethics, of moral Why do we think that there is good and bad? Why is there right and wrong, and so on? And why do most cultures, or even all cultures, agree that human beings have a special dignity, for example? And also this cannot be explained on a purely naturalistic paradigm. But actually, if you're a Christian, you know why humans have a special dignity, because they are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And it's a fact that is given from outside. It's a transcendent promise, and you cannot lose it. As soon as human dignity actually becomes a convention, it somehow can be attributed to human beings, or it can be withdrawn from human beings. For example, if they are not able to think consciously anymore because they suffer from dementia, or if they are not yet born, or if they just have been born. I mean, little babies, they are much more stupid. They don't understand Newton's gravitational law and so on. So should they have human dignity or not, and so on. So it's always really hard if you want to justify human dignity on the basis of what we can do
Yeah.
on certain abilities. And so even to that, and there it becomes very practical, that worldviews have consequences, not only in science, but also in social life and so on. And if we want to really guarantee for all human beings have the same dignity, no matter how rich they are, no matter how powerful they are, no matter where they are in hierarchy, then I think the Christian worldview is really the best basis to found that dignity.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And just like, I suppose whenever I was reading through a lot of the information about this kind of conflict, the two things that really surprised me were what you were saying earlier on about the mind, and having a mind that we can trust in order to do science. That was one of the big things that really got me, and it's almost like that scene in the Matrix movie where they're in the Nebuchadnezzar and they're discussing what chicken tastes like, and they all think that chicken, or sorry, excuse me, everything tastes like chicken. They were saying, and they were wondering how you can know what was right and what was wrong, how you can know what was true and not, because you were connected to the Matrix. And it's almost that idea, if we are the product of natural, unguided forces, how can we trust our minds because we're connected to the Matrix? And that was a big thing. And that really shocked me, to be honest with you. But the second thing that shocked me was any scientific journal you read, or any book that you read on this issue, they all mention Eugene Wigner and his essay on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. So maybe would you want to say something about mathematics just as we bring this to a close, if that's okay, and how mathematics actually and genuinely works in this world?
I mean, this paper is really a fascinating confession, I would say, because Eugene Wigner was also a friend of Albert Einstein and so on. And what this generation of scientists realized is that we can understand deep mysteries of the universe with mathematical formula, and easily structured formula. Yeah, not very complex. I mean, they are complex to the lay person, but for a mathematician, they are really beautiful, and they show symmetries and so on. And so that was really the fascinating thing, that you can describe the universe with these kinds of equations and actually make predictions from mathematical considerations what should be the case in nature. That was the other side of Eugene Wigner's paper, where he said that actually it's a miracle that we don't understand, neither deserve nor understand. So he says, we have not deserved this as human beings, as we always misuse, like the origin of the atomic bomb and so on. That also fell into his time, into his days, so on. So we can make predictions. For example, in 1929, it was a Hungarian physicist, Dirac, who actually combined Einstein's special relativity theory with quantum mechanics by Schrödinger. And when he combined these two systems, he found out from the solutions of that equation, the Dirac equation, that there are solutions with negative mass. They have the same properties like the solution with positive mass, but they have negative mass. And of course, negative mass does not make sense. And so he said the best explanation would be that there is antimatter. And so he predicted it should be possible to observe particles that are identical to the particles we know, like the electron, but have different charges, like not negatively charged, but positively charged. And so people set up experiments, and 3 years later, they actually measured positively charged particles and called them the positron, which is the anti-electron or the antiparticle to the electron. And we got this idea from mathematical considerations, which shows that the structure of the universe somehow is ruled by mathematical principles, by mathematical symmetries. There is a deeper level to reality than just matter. And when I actually discussed with an atheist philosopher, Bernulf Kanitscheider, who was one of the leading German atheist philosophers, especially in the relationship to science, he said that this phenomenon that mathematics seems to underlie physics and physical processes, material processes, actually. This is for him the greatest mystery, or the greatest argument that there is more than just matter, that there is something like maybe Platonic ideas that rule matter. And at the same time, Platonic ideas can be discussed again. How can ideas exist, especially something like justice or righteousness, if there is no one who righteousness is actually a category in relationships, like relationships can be righteous, but natural processes cannot be righteous. Natural processes are just the way they are. And so that shows that righteousness only makes sense if there is a relationship, someone to relate to. And so actually, I mean, he has died already, so I don't know how he went on with these thoughts and ideas, but I think to stay with Platonic ideas and idealism only is not really sufficient, I would say, because you again have to deal with some of his ideas and not with others if you don't deal with a personal creator who also is the origin of goodness, of ultimate love, of ultimate righteousness and justice, and so on. These categories only make sense if there is a real relationship. So the universe is only moral if there is a moral creator, a creator with a character that is reflected in our lives and in our consciousness and so on, conscience and so on. Yeah,
that's helpful. That's helpful. And it's another way of pointing toward something, for lack of a better word, Platonic, something that's immaterial, something that's transcendent. You get these ideas that come from that, and that's the big debate, even with mathematics, is whether it's Platonic or not, whether it's something that it's beyond us or not, beyond this physical realm or not. So it's interesting. Well, listen, thank you so much indeed. We've covered a lot of ground there. I think a lot of helpful ground as well in showing where the conflict really is, and showing that Christianity is definitely not anti-science, in fact pro-science. And the more that we understand about this universe, the more we can hopefully see fingerprints toward a good God behind this universe. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Fink. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for the great questions, and I hope that they are helpful. And there is lots of literature out there where you can find out more, or maybe with the documentary movies and so on. So yeah, just contact us, and I think you can get more information.
I'll put links in the description to your podcast and to those films you've done, and also, if you don't mind, to ELF resources that you've done quite a lot of scientific talks on that. So I'll put that all in the description. So thank you so much indeed, and thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful to you in bringing you along in your journey towards belief in God. There will be more up and coming discussions and talks. Do tune in. But again, thank you so much for listening, and Slán go forward.